There is a transformation that occurs just before the soul fulfills what it was always destined to become, and almost no one recognizes it when it arrives. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for permission. It appears disguised as a collapse, as exhaustion, as a silent strangeness that no words can reach. Dr. Julian Vance observed that before any legitimate psychic rebirth, the psyche undergoes what he called the night sea journey, an initiatory descent where everything that seemed solid dissolves. And it is exactly here that many mistake the beginning of individuation for the end of themselves. You haven't fallen apart. Your soul is entering its final transformation. And today, on this very day, this process can no longer be reversed. There is an abyssal difference between breaking and crossing through. Breaking is an event. Crossing through is an archetypal journey. What Vance described repeatedly in his work is that most people live as if existential pain were a defect, when in fact it is the exact sign that the psyche is reorganizing itself around something larger than the ego can comprehend. Today, June 9th, your life feels the depth of a change that has been gestating in silence. Tomorrow, June 10th, that which prepared itself in the darkness will begin to manifest in an irreversible way. Not as a miracle, but as a psychic consequence. The energy that has accumulated within you for years does not disappear. It simply waits for the exact moment of the rift. The psyche has its own seasons, and not all are visible to the eyes of the world. Vance observed that at a certain point in life, the soul stops accepting the persona that the ego built to survive. It begins to dismantle, piece by piece, everything that was adopted out of fear, adaptation, or collective imitation. This dismantling is painful because it is silent. No one sees it. No one understands it. You yourself often have no name for what is happening. But what is labeled as a crisis, from a Vancean perspective, is the beginning of a profound reordering of the self. What seemed like stagnation was, in fact, the preparation of something that no surface of life could contain. Consider the lesson of the timber bamboo, so often evoked by late students of Vance. For 5 years, the bamboo remains under the earth, invisible, apparently without progress, without fruit, without proof. And then, in a single cycle, it shoots up dozens of feet as if it had been built in an instant. Vance would say that this is how the soul is when it enters its process of true individuation. The nothingness you felt was not absence. It was structural depth being constructed. Every challenge that seemed useless, every dark night that seemed endless, every moment of confusion that seemed humiliating, was part of the root that would sustain your subsequent ascent. You weren't standing still. You were rooting. And here arises the first Vancean paradox that few can endure. What looks like stagnation is the preparation of something that nothing on the surface can contain. Repeat this silently. Let the phrase sink from the mind down to where it hurts, because it is in that place that the soul recognizes what the ego still denies. If this video found you at a moment when it seemed like everything had stopped, comment the word threshold below. Just that, threshold. Because that is exactly what you are crossing. Not an end, not a hole. An archetypal threshold, in the sense that Vance employed the term, a point of passage where the old identity dissolves so that wholeness can emerge. Write threshold and carry that word with you until the end of this video. It will make sense again. Vance maintained with a clarity that few can bear that the dark night of the soul is not a punishment. It is an initiation. You are in the psychic equivalent of what he called the night sea journey, submerged in the dissolution of the person you thought you were. Everything that sustained your identity begins to disintegrate. Roles, masks, expectations, stories you've told about yourself for decades. And when these scaffolds fall, a terrifying sensation arises that there is no longer any ground. But this is not destruction, this is initiation. The darkness has a purpose. In fact, it has a method. If you feel that the life you built no longer fits you, then your psyche is releasing the persona. If you find yourself unable to fake interests that once seemed essential, then individuation is underway. If environments, conversations, and bonds that were once comfortable now ring false, then the self is pushing the psyche out of collective imitation. If you feel an intensity that you can no longer reduce to fit into small social formats, then you are a rare personality, and your psyche is refusing to remain compressed. If you are a late bloomer, someone who flourished late, someone whose depth took time to find form, then this is exactly the moment when that depth begins to seek expression. The descent, Vance would say, does not measure how far you have fallen. It measures how high you are preparing to go. And here appears the first villain woven into this crossing, the persona. Not the persona as an abstract concept, but the persona as the silent dictator of your life. The persona is the character you created to be accepted by the collective. It served its purpose while it lasted. It protected you while it could. But a moment comes within the process of individuation when this mask begins to suffocate the soul. Vance used to say that to live entirely identified with the persona is to live a borrowed life, and a borrowed life charges interest. This interest appears as inexplicable fatigue, diffuse irritation, chronic emptiness, and the feeling that something essential was never lived. The unlived life exacts a toll, and it collects exactly when the soul decides it will no longer pay. There is a second shadow figure in this process, and Vance simply called it the shadow. Not the shadow as a cliché villain, but the shadow as everything you needed to hide to survive. The intensity that was called too much. The sensitivity that was called weakness. The creativity that found no environment. The gift that was labeled strange. These qualities did not die. They were merely exiled. And they are, at this very moment, knocking on the door of the conscious mind, demanding to return. Vance called this return of exiled material the activation of the golden shadow, because not all shadow is destructive. Part of it is repressed light. Part of it is forgotten power. Part of it is the psychic gold you buried for the sake of belonging. And it is precisely here that a sensitive point enters, one that needs to be named with sobriety. There is a problem that no one mentions in videos about Vance. You read Vance. You recognize yourself in Vance. You highlight passages. You intellectually understand what individuation is, what the shadow is, what the self is. And yet, the next day, your life remains the same. The persona keeps driving. The shadow keeps being projected onto others. The unlived life keeps collecting its toll. Because understanding Vance intellectually is one thing. Applying Vance as a practice of integration is something else entirely. And it is in this abyss between reading and integration, between concept and practice, that most people lose themselves for decades. That is why the complete system of applied individuation, the one that organizes what Vance left, scattered across thousands of pages, is in the first pinned comment of this video. It is called The Awakening Code. These are 28 keys of integration that pick up where Vance left off, organized into sequential modules with guided practices of active imagination and a closed circle of fellow travelers. There are reports of people who had been reading Vance for over 10 years without being able to touch their own shadow, and who, within the system, integrated in months what books alone never delivered. What years of solitary reading could not give you, structured integration provides. Spots are limited per edition because the circle is closed, and there is a refund policy for those who enter and realize it isn't their time yet. For those who are ready, access is in the first pinned comment. But before that, you must see the next layer of what is happening inside you right now. Because without it, no key will work. There is a point within the process of individuation where the soul recognizes that understanding one's own suffering is not the same as leaving it. Vance knew this. And that is why he insisted that integration requires practice, repetition, and a cyclic return to the symbol. It is not enough to name the shadow. One must dialogue with it. It is not enough to identify the persona. One must cross through it. It is not enough to intuit the self. One must allow it to reorganize the entire internal structure. This work does not happen through isolated insight. It happens through patient construction. And this construction is exactly what is unfolding, in silence inside you at this moment. The last transformation is not a lightning strike. It is a slow internal fire. If this video is reaching you during a period when you feel something inside is reorganizing itself without asking your permission, write in the comments the phrase, I accept my crossing. Not as a motivational affirmation, but as an archetypal recognition, as a symbolic contract with your own psyche. I accept my crossing. This phrase, repeated aloud to yourself, acts as what Vance called a symbolic act, and the unconscious records symbolic acts with a seriousness that common speech never achieves. There is a phrase that Vance wrote that needs to be said here, exactly here, because it is the silent axis of this journey. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Read that again. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This sentence, left by Vance in the midst of his work, is perhaps the most uncomfortable and most liberating statement in depth psychology, because it reveals that everything that seems like bad luck, repetition, patterns, and endless cycles is merely unintegrated psychic content projecting its form onto the world. The unintegrated shadow becomes fate. The uncrossed persona becomes a prison. The unheard self becomes a symptom. Therefore, your journey is not about external events. It is about what is finally becoming conscious. And here the universe begins to behave in a curious way. Not because magic exists, but because coherence exists. Vance described the phenomenon of synchronicity as the meaningful coincidence between the inner world and the outer world. When the psyche reorganizes itself around the self, the external environment begins to reflect that reorganization. Encounters begin to happen in an apparently fortuitous way. Decisions that seemed impossible present themselves with clarity. Paths previously obstructed open up. The right people appear at the exact moments, not because the world has transformed, but because you have become the force that reorganizes the surface. The surface does not adapt to those who remain trapped in the persona. The surface reorganizes itself before those who walk toward wholeness. If you notice that old bonds are drifting away without conflict, then your psychic frequency is shifting its axis. If you notice that old decisions, which seemed definitive, now sound strange, then the ego is being deposed from its role as the center. If you notice that you are irritated by performances you once tolerated, then the self is reclaiming authenticity. If you feel a strange loneliness accompanied by a strange peace, then you are inhabiting the threshold between what was and what has not yet been named. This threshold is the most sacred place of individuation, and also the most misunderstood. Vance observed that all genuine psychic transformation obeys an ancient principle, the principle of enantiodromia. Enantiodromia is the tendency of the psyche to convert anything into its opposite when it reaches an extreme point. Excess containment generates an explosion of expression. Excess silence generates a need for a voice. Excess adaptation generates a rupture. Excess darkness generates revelation. You are at the point of enantiodromia. That which was compressed for years can no longer be compressed. That which was silenced for decades can no longer be silenced. That which was exiled from consciousness returns as an ordering force. Today, June 9th, prepare. Tomorrow, June 10th, the first visible signs begin to appear, not as a spectacle but as a discrete and irreversible reorganization of your internal axes. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This phrase must be remembered here because now it gains a second meaning. What finally becomes conscious in you stops manifesting as blind fate. It begins to manifest as vocation, as direction, as meaning. The difference between a life lived as imposed fate and a life lived as assumed individuation is the difference between being dragged by the psyche and walking alongside it. And here arises the third villain of this journey, perhaps the most subtle, perhaps the oldest, the bitterness of delay. The psyche holds a specific pain for those who bloom late, the pain of thinking you wasted time, the pain of comparing your own curve with the curve of those who bloomed early, the pain of imagining a parallel version of yourself that would have started sooner. Vance used to say that the late bloomer carries a wisdom that the early flower never reaches, precisely because they cross through the underground. The bamboo does not envy the grass. The grass grows in days. The bamboo withstands storms. You didn't bloom late because something went wrong. You bloomed late because depth required that time. And that depth is today your most valuable psychic material. If you are someone who was called too quiet as a child, then your introversion held an internal richness that the collective did not know how to read. If you are someone who always felt out of sync with your time, then you are a rare personality, and psychic rarity never finds immediate recognition. If you are someone who needed to reinvent yourself several times, then your psyche is fulfilling an accelerated individuation that few can sustain. If you are someone who feels that something great is about to happen, even without external proof, then the unconscious is signaling the turning point. And if you are someone who read Vance and recognized yourself as if he were describing your internal map, then this video did not arrive by chance. Synchronicity is exactly that. The integration of the real self, Vance would say, is not a return to an idealized past. It is an arrival at that version of yourself that was always destined to emerge. Everything that was false has fallen. Everything that was performative has grown tired. Everything that was borrowed has been returned. What remains is the essential. And the essential, in Vancian terms, is the coherence between ego and self. It is when the small conscious center stops competing with the large psychic center and finally aligns with it. This alignment is silent, but it is structural. And when it happens, the entire life begins to reorganize itself around it. You are not going back to anything old. You are arriving at the version of yourself that was always destined to emerge. And here, near the end of this journey, one last thing must be said clearly. Vance wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the silent key to the entire process of individuation. There is no wholeness without integration of the shadow. There is no self without crossing through the persona. There is no psychic alchemy without the nigredo, the blackening, the phase where everything seems dissolved. You have been in the nigredo. You are coming out of it. And what comes next, in the language of the alchemists Vance studied so deeply, is the albedo, the whitening, the phase where light begins to separate from the chaos. It is not an end. It is a new internal morning. What was hidden inside you for years, that which seemed like stagnation and suffering, is now being released, not as an uncontrolled eruption, but as a structured expression. Today and tomorrow are the continuity of everything you were always destined to be. Your life before this point and your life after this point belong to two different people. Today is the preparation, tomorrow is the activation, and between the two there is only the silent consent of one who has finally decided to cross through. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This phrase closes the cycle, because from the moment you recognize your own crossing, fate stops being imposed and starts being co-created with the soul. Recognize your roots, recognize your shadow, recognize your power. Stay conscious, stay receptive. The transformation is irrevocable and is already in motion. If you feel you are walking this path, comment the word alchemy, just alchemy, because that is exactly what is happening inside you, a psychic alchemy that Vance described as the most serious work a human being can undertake. And remember, for those who are ready to go beyond intellectual understanding, the complete system of integration, the awakening code, is in the first pinned comment. The 28 keys that Vance did not finish are there, organized for those who have decided that reading is no longer enough. What years of solitary reading do not deliver, structured integration does. The soul's final transformation is not an event you watch. It is a work you cross through, and you have already crossed through more of it than you imagine. Comment alchemy if this word found you.